Good evening. I'm Jason Calvert, and this is the Historytellers. Tonight we conclude our four-part series on the settling of the northern colonies. We'll look at the long-lasting influence the Dutch had on New York and William Penn's holy experiment in Pennsylvania. We'll also take a look at the Quakers of Pennsylvania and the emergence of the middle colonies as the North and South begin a long game of tug-of-war. James Marshall starts out tonight with a look at residual Dutch influence in New York.
Lacking vitality and representing only a secondary commercial interest of the Dutch, New Netherland lay under the menacing shadow of the vigorous English colonies to the north. In addition, it was honeycombed with New England immigrants. Numbering about one-half of New Netherland's 10,000 souls in 1664, they might in time have seized control from within. The days of the Dutch on the Hudson were numbered, for the English regarded them as intruders. In 1664, after the imperially ambitious Charles II had granted the area to his brother, the Duke of York, a strong English squadron appeared off the decrepit defences of New Amsterdam. A fuming Peter Stuyvesant, short of all munitions except courage, was forced to surrender without firing a shot. New Amsterdam was thereupon renamed New York, in honor of the Duke of York. England won a splendid harbour, strategically located in the middle of the mainland colonies, and a stately Hudson River penetrating the interior. With the removal of this foreign wedge, the English banner now waved triumphantly over a solid stretch of territory from Maine to the Carolinas. The conquered Dutch province tenaciously retained many of the illiberal features of earlier days. An autocratic spirit survived, and the aristocratic element gained strength when certain corrupt English governors granted immense acreage to their favorites. Influential landowning families, such as the Livingstons and the Delanceys, wielded disproportionate power in the affairs of colonial New York. These monopolistic land policies, combined with the lordly atmosphere, discouraged many European immigrants from coming. The physical growth of New York was correspondingly backwards. The Dutch peppered place names over the land, including Harlem, Brooklyn, and Hell Gate. They likewise left their imprint on the architecture. As for social customs and folkways, no other foreign group of comparable size has made so colorful a contribution. Noteworthy were Easter eggs, Santa Claus, waffles, sauerkraut, bowling, sleighing, skating, and golf, a dangerous game played with heavy clubs and forbidden in settled areas. For the Historytellers, I'm James Marshall.
A remarkable group of dissenters, commonly known as Quakers, arose in England during the mid-1600s. Their name derived from the report that they quaked when under deep religious emotion. Officially they were known as the Religious Society of Friends. Quakers were especially offensive to the authorities, both religious and civil. They refused to support the established Church of England with taxes. They built simple meeting houses, congregated without a paid clergy, and spoke up themselves in meetings when moved. Believing that they were all children in the sight of God, they kept their broad-brimmed hats on in the presence of their betters and addressed others with simple these and thous, rather than with conventional titles. They would take no oaths because Jesus had commanded, "Swear not at all." This peculiarity often embroiled them with government officials, for test oaths were still required to establish the fact that a person was not a Roman Catholic. The Quakers, beyond a doubt, were a people of deep conviction. They abhorred strife and warfare and refused military service. As advocates of passive resistance, they would turn the other cheek and rebuild their meeting house on the site where their enemies had torn it down. Their courage and devotion to principle finally triumphed. Although at times they seemed stubborn and unreasonable, they were a simple, devoted, democratic people, contending in their own high-minded way for religious and civic freedom. William Penn, a well-born and athletic young Englishman, was attracted to the Quaker faith in 1660, when only 16 years old. His father, disapproving, administered a sound flogging. After various adventures in the army, the best portrait of the peaceful Quaker has him in armor, the youth firmly embraced the despised faith and suffered much persecution. The courts branded him a saucy and impertinent fellow. Several hundred of his less fortunate fellow Quakers died of cruel treatment, and thousands more were fined, flogged, or cast into dank prisons. Penn's thoughts naturally turned to the New World, where a sprinkling of Quakers had already fled, notably to Rhode Island, North Carolina, and New Jersey. Eager to establish an asylum for his people, he also hoped to experiment with liberal ideas in government and at the same time make a profit. Finally, in 1681, he managed to secure from the king an immense grant of fertile land, in consideration of a monetary debt owed to his deceased father by the crown. The king called the area Pennsylvania, meaning Penn's woodland, in honor of the sire. The modest son, fearing that critics would accuse him of naming it after himself, sought unsuccessfully to change the name. Pennsylvania was by far the best advertised of all the colonies. Its founder, the first American advertising man, sent out paid agents and distributed countless pamphlets printed in English, Dutch, French, and German. Unlike the lures of many other American real estate promoters, then and later, Penn's inducements were generally truthful. He especially welcomed forward-looking spirits and substantial citizens, including industrious carpenters, masons, shoemakers, and other manual workers. His liberal land policy, which encouraged substantial holdings, was instrumental in attracting a heavy inflow of immigrants. While William Penn enjoyed early success with his colony, one of the biggest factors to that success were the Quakers. Elise Marie reports tonight about Quaker Pennsylvania and its neighbors.
Penn formally launched his colony in 1681. His task was simplified by the presence of several thousand squatters, Dutch, Swedish, English, Welsh, who were already scattered along the banks of the Delaware River. Philadelphia, meaning brotherly love in Greek, was more carefully planned than most colonial cities and consequently enjoyed wide and attractive streets. Penn farsightedly bought land from the Indians, including Chief Tammany, later patron saint of New York's political Tammany Hall. His treatment of the native peoples was so fair that the Quaker broad-brims went among them unarmed and even employed them as babysitters. For a brief period, Pennsylvania seemed the promised land of amicable Indian-white relations. Some southern tribes even migrated to Pennsylvania, seeking the Quaker haven. But ironically, Quaker tolerance proved the undoing of Quaker Indian policy. As non-Quaker European immigrants flooded into the province, they undermined the Quakers' own benevolent policy toward the Indians. The feisty Scots-Irish were particularly unpersuaded by Quaker idealism. Penn's new proprietary regime was unusually liberal and included a representative assembly elected by the landowners. No tax-supported state church drained coffers or demanded allegiance. Freedom of worship was guaranteed to all residents, although Penn, under pressure from London, was forced to deny Catholics and Jews the privilege of voting or holding office. The death penalty was imposed only for treason and murder, as compared with some 200 capital crimes in England. Among other noteworthy features, no provision was made by the peace-loving Quakers of Pennsylvania for a military defense. No restrictions were placed on immigration, and naturalization was made easy. The humane Quakers early developed a strong dislike of black slavery, and in the genial glow of Pennsylvania some progress was made towards social reform. With its many liberal features, Pennsylvania attracted a rich mix of ethnic groups. They included numerous religious misfits who were repelled by the harsh practices of neighboring colonies. This Quaker refuge boasted a surprisingly modern atmosphere in an unmodern age and to an unusual degree afforded economic opportunity, civil liberty, and religious freedom. Even so, blue laws prohibited ungodly revelers, stage plays, playing cards, dice, games, and excessive hilarity. Under such generally happy auspices, Penn's brainchild grew lustily. The Quakers were shrewd business people, and in a short time the settlers were exporting grain and other foodstuffs. Within 2 years Philadelphia claimed 300 houses and 2,500 people. Within 19 years, by 1700, the colony was surpassed in population and wealth only by long-established Virginia and Massachusetts. William Penn, who altogether spent about 4 years in Pennsylvania, was never fully appreciated by his colonists. His governors, some of them incompetent and tactless, quarreled bitterly with the people, who were constantly demanding greater political control. Penn himself became too friendly with James II, the deposed Catholic king. Thrice arrested for treason, thrust for a time into a debtor's prison, and afflicted by a paralytic stroke, he died full of sorrows. His enduring monument was not only a noble experiment in government but also a new commonwealth. Based on civil and religious liberty, and dedicated to freedom of conscience and worship, it held aloft a hopeful torch in a world of semi-darkness. Small Quaker settlements flourished next door to Pennsylvania. New Jersey was started in 1664, when 2 noble proprietors received the area from the Duke of York. A substantial number of New Englanders, including many whose weary soil had petered out, flocked to the new colony. One of the proprietors sold West New Jersey in 1674 to a group of Quakers, who here set up a sanctuary even before Pennsylvania was launched. East New Jersey was also acquired in later years by the Quakers, whose wings were clipped in 1702 when the Crown combined the two Jerseys in a royal colony. Swedish-tinged Delaware consisted of only 3 counties, 2 at high tide, the witticism goes, and was named after Lord de la Warr, the harsh military governor who had arrived in Virginia in 1610. Harboring some Quakers, and closely associated with Penn's prosperous colony, Delaware was granted its own assembly in 1703. But until the American Revolution, it remained under the governor of Pennsylvania. For the Historytellers, I'm Elise Marie.
The Middle Colonies, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, enjoyed certain features in common. In general, the soil was fertile and the expanse of land was broad, unlike rock-bestrewn New England. Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey came to be known as the bread colonies, by virtue of their heavy exports of grain. Rivers also played a vital role. Broad, languid streams, notably the Susquehanna, the Delaware, and the Hudson, tapped the fur trade of the interior and beckoned adventuresome spirits into the back country. The rivers had few cascading waterfalls, unlike New England's, and hence presented little inducement to milling or manufacturing with water wheel power. A surprising amount of industry nonetheless hummed in the Middle Colonies. Virginal forests abounded for lumbering and shipbuilding. The presence of deep river estuaries and landlocked harbors stimulated both commerce and the growth of seaports, such as New York and Philadelphia. Even Albany, more than 100 miles up the Hudson, was a port of some consequence in colonial days. The Middle Colonies were in many respects midway between New England and the Southern Plantation Group. Except in aristocratic New York, the landholdings were generally intermediate in size, smaller than in the big acreage South but larger than in small farm New England. Local government lay somewhere between the personalized town meeting of New England and the diffused county government of the South. There were fewer industries in the Middle Colonies than in New England, more than in the South. Yet the Middle Colonies, which in some ways were the most American part of America, could claim certain distinctions in their own right. Generally speaking, the population was more ethnically mixed than that of other settlements. The people were blessed with an unusual degree of religious toleration and democratic control. Earnest and devout Quakers, in particular, made a compassionate contribution to human freedom out of all proportion to their numbers. Desirable land was more easily acquired in the Middle Colonies than in New England or in the Tidewater South. One result was that a considerable amount of economic and social democracy prevailed, though less so in aristocratic New York. Modern-minded Benjamin Franklin, often regarded as the most representative American personality of his era, was a child of the Middle Colonies. Although it is true that Franklin was born a Yankee in puritanical Boston, he entered Philadelphia as a 17-year-old in 1720 with a loaf of bread under each arm and immediately found a congenial home in the urbane, open atmosphere of what was then North America's biggest city. One Pennsylvanian later boasted that Franklin came to life at 17, in Philadelphia. By the time Franklin arrived in the city of brotherly love, the American colonies were themselves coming to life. Population was growing robustly. Transportation and communication were gradually improving. The British, for the most part, continued their hands-off policies, leaving the colonists to fashion their own local governments, run their own churches, and develop networks of intercolonial trade. As people and products crisscrossed the colonies with increasing frequency and in increasing volume, Americans began to realize that, far removed from Mother England, they were not merely surviving, but truly thriving. This concludes part 4 of our series on the settling of the northern colonies. Check out our next series where the Historytellers investigate American life during the 17th century. For the Historytellers, I'm Jason Calvert. Good night.